Hello, my name is Matthew Williams. I'm the head of strength and conditioning at St. Anselm College. This presentation is set out to explain what we did during spring of 24 and the results that we got from going about those ideas. During this presentation, none of these ideas are necessarily original to me. They are taken from other coaches, hopefully coaches that I have referenced throughout, and you should go and see their original pieces if those things interest you. And the reason that I have put this together is one, to sort of put some more long form content out there into the training universe, and also to see if any other coaches are doing something like this, if they have feedback, and if I am making any glaring errors that I need to address. So the changes to spring 24 was really to help set up the fall of 24. The idea that really set this off was changing the fall camp schedule from a 6-day on, 1-day off to a 3-day on, 1-day off model that we'll talk about later in this presentation. Now, both myself and Coach Adam have not been part of running something like this, so we wanted to test it out during the spring to allow us to see how it worked in its original concept and make the changes that we needed to ready for the fall. Now, one of the nice things about this spring with the changes of the Division II rules is that we are able to play a game at the end of the spring. So it was perfect to sort of demonstrate that setup ready for what would be the first game of the season come September. With that compressed spring schedule to it now only being 3 weeks compared to that sort of normal 6 or 5 week schedule, depending on where spring break would end up, means that we had a greater amount of open space for winter conditioning. Now, although it's just a benefit of this change, this was really good for us because we don't see our athletes over the summer. And while packets are okay and they can do some piece of the job, I think that as multiple coaches are saying more and more, like, your goal is to remove yourself as the coach. So if we could take 9 weeks of a lot of focused physical prep time to not only make some changes, but to also teach our athletes how they should look to train when they are at home, I think that's going to make a big benefit in both this summer and then in the coming futures. The second one, which is also somewhat helpful just for being in the space that we are, is that the Northeast is always going to be cold during the spring, and if we can push back our practice times or our practice days to the later months of that spring semester, we're hopefully going to avoid as much of the bad weather as we can, especially in our situation due to really only one turfed area that can be used for practice, and having a full slate of spring sports along with the soccers and the field hockeys, you're always looking at either practicing at 6 a.m. or 8 p.m. And if you're looking at doing those and starting in March, it's going to be extremely, extremely cold that can not only impact practice, but can also impact, the health of those athletes during that time. So this was our overview of our winter conditioning. Now, we had the privilege of being able to use an indoor turf facility on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I have to speak very highly of Coach Adam for being willing to do that. And then on Monday and Friday, we used an indoor facility that was about 3 basketball gyms worth of space. Now, Monday, coming back off a weekend off and assuming that our students were going to behave like college students, the goal was to hopefully wake up the CNS and prepare for that week. That led to some low volume, higher effort work with our upper body resilience on that day. Tuesday and Thursday, it was important to use the turf time to its fullest. We had an hour session on each of these days, and the goal was to use these as our football skill sessions. Under the NCAA rules, we could have 2 hours where we could use football and do some football-like activities. So eventually we progressed this into finishing with 7-on-7. Now, wanting to use the most of this turf time to gain the agility and change of direction stimuluses, this did limit our max velocity training. And then both these days were our big output days in the weight room. Now, Friday, the real goal for this was just to try to make the most of a day after a high day. Possibly should have gone in and flipped these days in hindsight, but I messed up in our planning and we ended up with this with our booking as we went through the semester. So as you can see on the slide, these were our KPIs for our winter conditioning. Weight was mainly just tracked for our coaches and then as well to give our athletes that were either a little bit too light or a little bit too heavy something to focus on as we went through the 9 weeks. 10-meter fly was used for our speed. We only used meters because our lasers couldn't detect under a second when it came to running and yardage. And then that truck stick for the bigger guys, just to make sure that they were also focused on speed and something that allowed them to compete outside of just raw times. For strength, lower body wise, we went with the front squat. And we went with the front squat because this school has had 4 strength coaches in the last 4 years. And the main consistency between all of these programs is that front squat has been the strength exercise that they've used the most. So it made sense just to continue on using this that athletes would be used to. And obviously most people can bench press or have bench press before. Vertical jump for our power. This was taken using a vert mat. We do have a vertec, but the limitations of being a single coach and having 100 so athletes made it that the vertical jump being taken on the jump mat was better logistically. So we'll start off by just diving into what we did on the field or outside of the weight room. So for our acceleration day, our main work during this day was a resisted sprint. Due to being inside and being limited by space, the goal was to try to allow for athletes to get maximum outputs while not running into walls or anything like that. Our choices for resistance was to go with either manual resistance or chains. We decided to use chains and we worked down from 30 pounds to 10 pounds, going 3 weeks at each resistance and gaining a rep each week. So we went from 4 to 5 to 6. Once we were able to go outside, we extended out the yardage to about 25 yards and stayed at 10 pounds to prepare mainly our skills for those extended accelerations that they would see in spring ball. Prior to working through these resisted accelerations, we had a large number of athletes and we wanted to get them prepared. We worked through 3 different stations and used these as an extended warm-up. We had to spend about 5 minutes at each of these stations. Our resisted drills, these were taken directly from Scott Leach's Gridiron Warrior program and were used as warm-up prep exercises that I really liked, especially with the limitations of our floor space. It allowed us to gain a little bit of technical mastery before we moved on to acceleration games when we got outside. These resisted drills, like I said, became acceleration games and kneeling accelerations once we got outside, and I felt like the basis of acceleration had been taken care of. Vertical jumps was another station. This was mainly hurdle jumps, and this followed a very basic progression of sticking landings to continuous and double leg to single leg. The med ball station ended up being kind of a nothing station for us, especially once we were able to go outside and we replaced it with horizontal jumps. I would have liked to have kept the horizontal jumps from the beginning. However, we felt it was a little bit unsafe jumping on the floor that we had access to. Therefore, the med ball station was then sort of included into the vertical jumps eventually, just to get the athletes working on some intent. Like I said, the horizontal jumps replaced the med balls once we were able to go outside, and we probably need to do a lot more of these in the first 6 weeks of our program, and they were definitely missed. That was an error on my part when I just looked back through our data of being able to accelerate and the changes that happened with our acceleration. So this is just a compilation of everything that we went through during these Mondays. It doesn't incorporate everything that we did, and it doesn't necessarily show a progression. However, it should just give the listener and you watching hopefully an idea of what we look to do each and every day when we went out during these weeks. Obviously, you can see the progression from anything that's indoor was most likely at the beginning of the semester, and then anything that is happening outdoor was done closer to the end. And you can see just in a little bit sort of the space that we had to work with. And I'm sure as a coach, if you're in the Northeast or having to work inside with a team that likes to use or is mainly using the turf, that floors like that can be a little sketchy, especially if they're not looked after well. This is an acceleration game taken directly from Scott Leach's Gridiron Warrior. He goes into more detail about how he progressed those, but we really like those games. And then finally, the resisted accelerations that made up the main meat of this acceleration day. As mentioned before, lots of what we did during this time was taken directly from or influenced from Scott Leach's Gridiron Warrior, as well as a lot of the contact prep work was taken from Andy Ryland and his presentations, both on Strength Coach Networks and the things that he puts out there for free. General session template went for a warm up and then into some closed change directions. For this, we would use a grid so that we can just implement very simple movement patterns, and we just changed these up as we went through 9 weeks. Some guys absolutely loved it. Some guys absolutely hated it and asked multiple times for it to be taken away. I do think that if we're looking for adaptation, it doesn't always create adaptation, but it's a great way to get prepared for those things that might cause that. Once we finished there, we moved or divided the group into stations, and then we'd work around these stations for sort of 8 to 10 minutes, depending on what we plan to do that day. Contact prep, this covered everything from pushing competitive games to rolling and lifting, and this eventually became our tackling practice once we got out of that prep work. Everyone had to partake in this, including quarterbacks, including specialists, even including our linemen. Whether it's a good idea or not, I'm not sure, but I do think that exposing every athlete to having to make a tackle and the correct way to do it can help them and help us as a team, whether that be making a stop on a turnover to prevent a score, or not every quarterback's going to play, and maybe one of those backups decides that they want to go try and have an impact on the team doing something else, whether that be special teams or whether that be a change of position. And to be able to do those, knowing how to tackle is some prerequisite knowledge. Close space, high contact. Obviously, these were smaller areas, lots more cutting, and then sort of slower overall speeds. Contact was increased just due to the smaller spaces. Large spaces, obviously the opposite for that. Bigger areas, allowing us to get to that sprint zone, and then having to slow down as we get a little bit closer. Just like with everything, these were progressed through tiers. These tiers were taken again directly from Gridiron Warrior, and I really think that while they helped lay out our foundation, we could have been a little bit more aggressive with the progression of these into sort of the full drills that we did at the end. And finally, our X Factor station, or our Flying 10, just because of how our week ended up being laid out, this was the best time for us to do our Fly 10 testing, which was always done on a Thursday. And then on a Wednesday, it would either be used as an X Factor game, something that maybe didn't necessarily fit into our close space, wide space, or whether it was just something a little bit of fun for that day. When we were doing our Fly 10s, we would start with our bigs group at that Fly 10 position, and then have our fastest athletes finish there. The thought process there was that it would just give a little bit more chance for those faster guys to get warmed up, whereas the bigger guys were probably not running at a speed that put them at any risk coming off of a general warm-up and a closed sort of change direction piece. Once we finished that, we got together as a full group. Obviously, I'm sure if you've being in a football team or being around a football team, that your head coaches have decided to do a winter conditioning competition. So we would get those teams of that competition and play some head-to-head games. We played lots of handball. We played bulldog, which is similar to sharks and minnows, except I think there's some slight variation changes. And then we also played a game that ended up sort of being last play of the game, 5-on-5. You get one forward pass, and then everything else has to be laterals. If there's a tag, it just swaps around and you go again. This would also be when we would progress into 7-on-7 as we got later down closer to the spring. So this is a compilation of our small space drills. For our first set, many of these drills were either mirror or tracking drills, both 2D and 3D, with the goal being to expose the athletes to responding to a partner or a opposition stimuli instead of a closed change direction drill like they probably had during the winter. The second step for our progression was to add some space and create drills that were more like replicating the tracking needed to make a tackle or working around a tackle. Defensively, the big piece that I asked our coaches was to push some communication when defending a free runner. Maybe it's just the teams that I've been around or my limitations in knowledge, but I feel like oftentimes communication can be limited when defenders are coming from different levels, leading to oftentimes tacklers thinking they're in a one-on-one when really they're in a 2v1, and that technique can change. I'm not sure that we made enough of an emphasis on this, but I'd be interested to hear any others' opinions on talking post-snap, definitely. Finally, we just added some greater space to these drills or added some different complexities to them. One of the big things that I wanted when we were in 2v2 or something like that is that I didn't want the coaches to talk about the player who didn't have the ball as a blocker, possibly to encourage just some thought processes outside of normal football. So can we lateral the ball? Because if we don't do it in something like this, where it doesn't matter if we make a mistake, we're not going to do it during the game. And it did happen to against us in the previous fall, and it would be nice to do that back to people. Final piece, the tail grab was a massive hit for both players and coaches, and I really like the game. The game is from Nick Giblins, and it's a great game. This is a compilation of our large space drills. Phase 1 for us was mainly working some reactive accelerations. I was nervous about injuries during these segments of drills in particular, especially as we were working through our deceleration progression during the closed change of direction work. In hindsight, we probably could have been a little bit more aggressive with what we were doing, as I do not believe that our athletes possibly lost these abilities over break. Now, phase 2 and 3 were pretty much the same drills, just either changing them slightly or expanding the space or adding some different limitations or even including extra freedoms. Big one for us that highlighted some of our issues was the sideline chase, especially the one-on-one. Oftentimes, players struggle to close that space, and I hope that both of our players and our coaches got to see that there's a big difference between tracking at full speed than tracking at 75% when someone can do the drill perfectly. I think the impact of having to go from the sprint zone to the shimmy or the strike zone helped with our tracking. However, I have recently seen some Andy Ryland stuff, and he talks about the need to go instead of to a shimmy to a squatted sprint. I really like that idea and would like to have tried to implement it during our running of these drills and look forward to doing it during the summer and also into next winter. Again, as we go through, a lot of these drills are taken directly from the Gridiron Warrior product, with some as well being just straight from our coaching staff. This punt one in particular was taken directly from a drill that they would do in camp. We just sort of added some more space and made it a little bit more difficult on the defenders. These are our contact prep videos, as well as our tackling videos at the end. There was nothing special with our progression here. Phase 1 for us was lots of bodyweight tempo work, mainly using the bear position and partner lifting, as well as moving into hand fighting or wrist control games that are put out there by both Andy and Scott. Phase 2 was just the inclusion of a greater amount of competition, whether it be through bear position pushing games, push-up position games, or get-ups as you see right here. Now this, for us, was the first implication of why these drills can be helpful, as we saw that our O-line group was probably our least intense group. This led to us adding just a little bit of more of a mixture of our groups to really drive that intensity throughout the team, and I think it really helped us push on with that competitive spirit as we went through the winter. Now phase 3, we just moved these battles to feet, and then we got even more competitive. Every few weeks, we'd probably drop in a sort of king of the ring competition that would use a variation of a push game, and we'd score the winner to add points to that greater football competition that we went through. Now, after completing these phases over 6 weeks, we worked into tackling, felt that it was important to touch on tackling during this time, as nobody would have tackled or been tackled since November. Now, we spent about 50% of our time during this drill working on impact and leg drive. This was often just hitting a bag or a shield and then running the feet, with the other 50% wanting to work the finish of a tackle. Now, we didn't have a crash mat to begin with, so a lot of this work was done using tool bags just to hopefully avoid any falling issues, and we really tried to emphasize the placement of feet having a solid wrap. Then once we got back to campus and we could use that crash pad, we would do some of that more intense tackling where we were actually taking a person to the floor as well as getting that impact. During this time, we also tried to work some of those other tackle variations, whether that be playing a handoff or trying to make a tap tackle. I do think we did some solid work during this tackle phase. However, I don't think we were at the intensity that I really wanted us to be at, but that's okay. We were exposing our athletes to something that was really, really new for them, especially tackling without pads on. But unfortunately, I was also reminded once we got out to the spring how difficult it is to remove some of the habits that athletes are so used to, because the second that the pads were put back on, heads were going across the body for many, many tackles. And then finally, for this change of direction day, we have our X Factor stuff. This was anything that didn't really fit into the first 3 categories and included our testing of our fly 10s. Many of these things were obviously just variations of races. Hoop races and tennis ball races made up a large amount of our first phase. The second phase included things like Frogger, which I'm really loving as a drill. We also included some arc races or some curved runs to get some of those curve running exposures. Phase 3 was just the inclusion of cutbacks in these races, and this has really influenced our coaches, especially when it comes to their evaluating of players, as they're including that now in their summer camps as they look into the recruits for the future. On Thursdays, like mentioned before, this is where we did our fly 10s. For these, we followed a progression from Mark Boyle, working from 5 yards to a 15 yards in, and we progressed every 3 weeks. While I did feel like this was a really safer progression, working very slowly, especially compared to some of the progressions I had had before, I don't feel like there was a massive speed change during this progression. Likely it was possible that our athletes were able to always run at the speeds that they hit weeks 7 to 9 when they had a 15-yard run-in, but because they were only at a 5-yard run-in, they weren't able to get up to these speeds. So I'm not sure that did we actually get them faster. Equally, and it's stupid looking back on it, these fly 10 exposures were the only real top speed work that we did all week. I think that was definitely an oversight, and we need more top speed than what we did. Thinking into the future, possibly either adding that to a Tuesday or editing that Friday so we get rid of our conditioning, because I do think we got a lot of that through our stations on these change of direction days, and finding some more time to do some true top speed. So to begin with, my desire for this day was to complete a circuit of tempo running, partner lifting, and a bare position tempo. However, that first week it was quite difficult to change direction on that floor, and I felt like we were increasing the impacts on the lower limb too much by running a large amount of volume on that floor. So we changed it to become what ended up being a 7-station lower impact session. Now these stations were a stationary bike, a bare position tempo, a bag lift that we used rugby bags, had the athletes throw them over their shoulder, jump rope, and then the lifting tempo that we would do in that phase one. We also tried pummeling one week. The group didn't really take to it as much as I had hoped. However, I think that if I had stuck it out, this could have been a really useful station. The last two stations were med balls and a rest station. Now we worked for 5 weeks here, from 20 seconds to 40 seconds on, with the rest being whatever was left of that minute. We started about 18 minutes and worked up to 25 at the end of the 5 weeks. But when we finished this, we played some 5 versus 5 basketball. There was some terrible basketball being played, but the conditioning here was probably somewhat more impactful than the conditioning that we actually did in these stations. So maybe we should have just played 5 versus 5 basketball for the entire time. Overall, this may not have been a needed day. I feel like our change of direction and the games that we played probably took care of most of the conditioning that we did. As I look to the future, I think that we got to think about trying to implement some more top speed work on maybe a Thursday or a Friday, and trying to create an extra day where we can use turf to facilitate both that top speed and the change of direction. But that'll probably be a budget thing in the future. For the weight room, we worked a 2-week rotating program. This was the first time trying something like this. It was put forth to me from a conversation with Dr. Justin Lima prior to going into the winter. I think this worked a lot better than the usual 3-week phase that I would usually run. I felt like it allowed the variation for me to give the athletes was a lot greater, especially after coming off quite a low variety in-season program that we had just come out of. I also think that the athletes got a lot more enjoyment out of it by having this ever-changing program. Now, I don't think that's necessarily important, and I do agree with the fact that oftentimes we change things up just because we feel like we need to, not because the athlete needs the change. However, I would say that due to the extra loads that we were putting on this population of our athletes have never done something like this, that just avoiding any monotonism was probably going to help keep their buy-in as we went through the entire 9 weeks. And then just like any normal program, we started off with a little bit greater volumes, creating that foundation, as they say, to then building into those more intense outputs and a lot less volume. Monday's lift continued from the on-field work. The goal was lower stress work, but hitting those things that we felt were needed for the upper body that we didn't necessarily have time to hit on Thursday when we were trying to get our big outputs. In our first block, which counted as our warm-up on these days as we didn't get to go directly from run to lift, was used to just establish some more extensive volumes, as well as eventually revisit some of the foundational contact prep work that we did as we went through our intensifications. For the medball work, we started at 20 seconds for each exercise and extended up to 35 seconds over 4 weeks. These included chest passes, passes from the hip and overhead, we only had access to large, soft medicine balls, and I would love to have used some of those smaller medicine balls for single arm work, but that was just a difficulty with the medicine balls and the amount of people we had in each group. Like I said, our crawling continued on from the contact prep and included lots of the basic bear and crab positions that we went through during that phase 1 of contact prep. For the odd weeks, our main exercises was putting the shoulders in some extreme ranges of motion, as well as establishing some greater muscle mass on the upper back. We had introduced some of these during our full and our post-game lifts, so we really tried to emphasize loading those greater ranges of motion. During our even weeks, I wanted to put a greater focus on those less normal upper body lifting things. As for the most part, our athletes have been exposed to barbells for the upper body and med ball throws and those sorts of things. These days, we wanted to deal with our body weights at speeds to hopefully prepare our athletes to deal with others at speed. We had a lot of success, in my opinion, on introducing monkey bars to the team. It was fantastically scalable, and although we didn't actually have true monkey bars, the pull-up bars worked really well, and I really don't like our pull-up bars normally. Our athletic trainer asked us to add a greater amount of band pull-aparts during the winter due to their opinion of increasing shoulder injuries that happen during the fall and trying to navigate and negate some of these. We didn't actually add any band pull-aparts, and I believe that what we did on these days would take care of that. And although I believe that some luck was involved, the contact prep and some of the exercises that we did, putting these shoulders in those inconvenient and weak positions, led to us not having any new shoulder injuries. Body armor was nothing exciting and was just some focus on those smaller muscle groups and allowing our athletes to get a pump, which they enjoyed, and we added some carries to the end of that block to make it, I guess, somewhat more productive. For our neck training, we progressed through both manual and banded resistant movements, both dynamic and isometric in nature. We moved on to bodyweight bridges at the end. It took very little time, but I think that we had a lot of benefit from this network. However, I did find that this was the thing that I would catch our athletes skipping or trying to cut corners on, and I probably need to push the importance of it a little bit more in the future. Again, this is just a compilation of some of the things that we worked through in our upper body sessions. This was how we went about our monkey bars, just working up and down, and then the scalable option for our bigger people. And then just some simple variations for our body armor and things like that. So this was our biggest output day of the week. For the odd weeks, we focused on single leg or quasi single leg work, and then on our even weeks, we did the opposite. For the entire time, we used a self-selected weights and then used the tempo as the controller of the intensity. I've been using the triphasic quote-unquote tempo progression, working eccentric to isometric. However, after hearing Justin Lehman talk about how he flipped them, I decided to try that for this winter season. I much preferred this way of going about it and felt that the athletes were better prepared to be stronger in these positions when we began with the isometric and then progressed into the eccentric. We didn't track our single leg strength numbers, as it would have been a little bit difficult to keep on top of that data, just being one person and using sheets and having to input it manually. Front squat was used as our tracking exercise, and we would finish these tempos with open sets on those odd weeks. These were 5-3-1 style open sets. However, I allowed the athletes again to self-select. In hindsight, I do think it would have been good to use a predicted 1RM and the relevant percentages after that 5+. However, we did see a solid increase in strength from the 5+ to the 1+. Possibly these were strength gains, or possibly the athletes were just getting better at expressing their strength, just like we had with the max velocity piece from before. During the volume block, the accessory work was always the opposite to the focus of that week. For the double leg stuff, I would have loved to use a leg press, but as I don't have one, We just got a lot of our work from high volume slant board goblet squats during this time. Then as we intensified, we obviously dropped that extra volume, and then we included the power complex. I really liked this and felt that the athletes also really enjoyed this process. Our jump variations followed the single leg or double leg bias for the day. Approach jumps were a massive hit, especially after measuring our roof and HVAC systems and putting tabs on those to really drive the intent of our athletes. Most of our vertical jumps PRs occurred after these approach jumps. Looking at it in the future, I really wish I had added some more jump variations during these power complex days. Again, this is just a compilation of our lower body output work. This was the first time trying the Hatfield split squat, and I do think it's a very good exercise, and it allows the athletes to feel strong, especially during stress. We lent on those during our spring bull lifts, and I do think that having that feeling of lifting something heavy and seeing something heavy even when you are so fatigued is useful even for the mental aspect of it, and I'm looking to sort of include that in our full strength work. This is our highest jumper. It says it was 40 inches on the jump mat. I'll let anybody watching decide if it was an acceptable jump or not. And then these are two examples of the power complexes that we went through, one being single leg focused, the other one being a little bit more bilateral focused. The Thursday upper body output day was very similar to the lower output day. Not much to say here. Wanted to include a greater single arm pressing that we had done before. I also do think that although not in similar ranges of motion as they will face in the sport, I believe overhead pressing is important and not dangerous when it comes to shoulder health, so we included that throughout. During the intensity block, I tried to implement another similar power block idea for the upper body. I feel this worked as a good primer for our strength work, but I'm not sure that it had that much effect outside of that. One thing in particular that we saw on this day was the landmine jerk. I'm a big fan of that. It was very easy to teach and it got our athletes working for intent. I gave the athletes a choice of which leg they wanted to use, and it was interesting to see that the defenders decided that they wanted to always match their arm and the leg, as they said that this was their technique when taking on a block. Now, I don't think that really matters in the grand scheme of things, and you can argue about anything to do with specificity and all that crap as much as you'd like, but it was really nice to actually have them be thinking about their own training this time, and hopefully showed that we were making a little bit of an impact on having our athletes at least take a little bit more ownership and thought in their training, even if it isn't necessarily the most important part of training. And again, just some more compilations of videos that we took from this upper body day. And then these exercises here were what formed our sort of power complex on these more intense upper body days. And then our final lift of the week was the Friday, and the assumption was that our athletes were going to be very low on readiness and very high on fatigue. The main aim of this day was to add some longer period loads onto the tissues via isometrics, and then add some more single leg work through some different variations. For the isos, we only progressed by about 10 seconds per set over the time from 20 to 30 seconds, focused more on load. I found during the season that our athletes were not really pushing themselves when it came to extending time, and would just do the same weight, whether it was 20 seconds or 45. So really wanted to try and drive them on increasing load by not increasing the time, and then we'll work on time as the summer continues. For our double leg iso, we started off using a trap bar. However, I found that this really pumped up the lower back, and to the point that it was limiting. So we moved on to the wall sit, and the wall sit, although being a pain to set up, was a perfect and very loadable exercise. The only other key piece to note from this day was that we used a knee over the toe split squat. Knee over the toe is not the brand or the answer that it is branded to be, but it was a good test for our athletes, and I think it got them thinking about their ranges of motion and really tried to have them drive to find usable ranges of motion more than just the stretching that they do on their own. Again, just a little compilation of the things that we did on this day. And then to finish with, this is some of the neck work that I had recorded. So these were at the end of the winter conditioning period, and these are just some of the variations of the bridges that we went through, whether that be a lateral bridge or a more linear one. So these are the KPI outcomes that we got from the winter. Weight-wise, we didn't have any massive swings in body weight. We had some small moves of both of a few percent up or a few percent down for the people that really needed it. We're unable to have a real impact on caloric intake due to some budget restrictions and a very interesting campus meal plan system that doesn't really accommodate gaining mass very well. Speed, as mentioned before, a lot of the data improvements, I think, come from just extending the run in space. So really cannot look at this data and be happy that we truly improved speed, but hopefully allowed our athletes to demonstrate this speed better, as well as become more resilient to high-speed soft tissue injuries, and can be used as a step-off point in the future for our speed training. Obviously, the truck stick is influenced by this, and with speed increasing, obviously that increased too, but not massive growths there. Raw data wise, we had 9 athletes over 20 miles an hour and 3 guys over 1,000 on a truck stick. And I'm looking forward to trying to get these groups a little bit bigger as we go. Strength wise, I think we got to be pleased with these improvements. As a team, we needed to get stronger relatively, in my opinion, and I would like to have us more around that 1.7 number, although we did have a good number of athletes around that 2 times body weight. So we probably need to start looking at giving our athletes some other options outside of just pursuing that front squat more and more and more. Similar to the squat, I think we had some good improvements, but I again would like to see some more relative strength increases. However, I'm just less worried about this than the front squat. Raw numbers wise, our best front squat was 480 and our best bench was 400 pounds. Power, some slight gains in the vertical jump. Disappointed with the number of athletes that got their best jump in our first few weeks of training, especially those 7s that hit it during week number 1, but I am happy that so many other athletes got it during week 9. We never really focused on the vertical jump. We always trained it after our either sprint day or after our power complex. So seeing those improvements is still really nice. Raw data wise, we had 2 athletes jump over 40 inches, but obviously using a jump mat, these are probably inflated. So I think it's important that we look back and try to compare the winter that we had for the winter before. Obviously things were very different, but we can only compare to what was done prior in this specific circumstance. And now, as should be expected, with the increased focus on physical prep, our numbers should be greater than they were the year before. However, I was definitely worried that with the increased load on the athletes, that maybe these raw data points wouldn't be there because they couldn't handle the volumes, causing reduced results compared to the year before. I am happy that we increased even in small amounts with that increased field work, and look forward to being able to compare these a little bit more accurately into next year. So this is the hard piece to put in the presentation. These were our injuries that we suffered during the winter conditioning. The injuries that we had were graded as out by our athletic trainer, which meant that they were out for that day or at least one practice or lift session. We had 8 hamstrings. Now 7 of those were grade 1 with a grade 2. The grade 2 was caused during deceleration. That's the first time I've seen anything like that, and I'm going to go back through and review some of the research and how people are applying and working around that, as I do not understand the mechanics and how to work around and prepare an athlete to avoid that from happening again. We suffered 3 quad injuries during the winter. Now these were mainly into the upper part of the quad, into the hip flexor. 2 backs, these were both spasms, shoulder, pec, ankle, and knee. Now 5 of these injuries occurred on the first day of the week, the hamstrings and the quads mainly. Now obviously the goal was to keep the volume low and to work around the athletes coming back off a weekend and them being college students, but I think that is a perfect example of the fact that maybe the volume was not low enough, maybe the preparations were not enough. Secondly, the hamstrings, I have to take a better look at the technical work that I am putting the athletes through during this time, as although as mentioned before, the amount of top speed work we did was not great, and I think that the progression was safe. We were still having these injuries occurring during our Fly 10 testing, which probably means that the athletes were not prepared well enough by myself technically to run in a correct way to avoid these things. We had 3 contact injuries. These were the shoulder, the ankle, and the knee. The shoulder was during some contact prep work, but was not a new injury. The ankle was falling during an activity, so I'm going to have to, I guess, chalk that one up to bad luck. And then the knee was an MCL sprain that occurred during a Frogger exercise, but I think it was just knee-to-knee contact. I didn't actually see that one happen. The one that was truly bad was the pec injury. Now, I had set the rules that we talked about earlier, that Monday was to be used as a ramp-up day. However, we were on a 2-day return week, and I decided to break those rules because I wanted to push in the higher output stuff on the 2 days we had. That ended up to myself programming a 1+ on that Monday, and that led to a pec tear, which, although the athlete says you cannot blame yourself for that, I do take some responsibility there and should not have programmed a max effort output like that coming off of 2 days off. he is currently now working back to hopefully be healthy to play this season. And then practice missed. That's a large number of practices missed due to injuries that occurred through conditioning, and definitely something that I will be taking a look at going forward. Now moving forward, just to discuss spring ball, what that looked like for us, and the outcomes that occurred following that plan. So the planning of spring ball, this was 3 days on, 1 day off. This was inspired by Joel Reinhardt's plan that he mentioned in a Justify Performance podcast. And he talked about in that podcast, coming in, if you're going to bring something to a coach, make sure you would be able to explain it and do the whole thing if they let you did it or let you do it. And that's what Coach Adam did. He sort of let me roll with it. So it was really useful. It was also influenced by the calendar that's in that first level of the system by Fergus Connolly. I laid out what I thought was the best way for us to do it going off of there, and then the coaches and I sat down and discussed one, getting on the same page verbally and conceptually, and also making sure that they were able to do everything that they wanted. The day one, or the green day as it was called, was our big teaching day. Really wanted to get over to the coaches that day one, whether post and off day, first day of camp, etc., cannot be the biggest day. I think that's often the issue that people come into. As mentioned before, even in our winter condo, most of our injuries occurred on that day one, so it's important to get the body back into the work and revved up for things to come. The biggest desire here was to sort of just slow them down on that day and then let them be a little bit more free on day 2 and day 3. It was interesting to hear them talk about how difficult it was to adapt to this and having to sort of break out of the normalcy of practice to interrupt. And some of our defensive coaches talked about having to sort of step down and walk down into the defensive backfield post play to sort of move and walk and talk things around. Something I had to learn when working with the coaches was sort of how they wanted to install their tactical needs. And that was one of the biggest things we talked about, was giving them enough time that they could install when essentially losing a third of their sessions for us to go red on those days. We did help ourselves by installing some of that stuff 7-on-7, especially for the away from line of scrimmage guys, and this allowed the athletes to come into that springtime with some of that playbook already installed, or the base of it at least installed. It also allowed our O-line during that springtime or the winter condo when we were doing 7-on-7 to sort of walk and talk through some of their assignments as well. So thankfully we covered some of that teaching, which maybe helped us make up for the missing 1/3. These practices often end up being helmeted only. However, especially for our O-line, they discussed the desire that these would actually end up being padded. The reason for this was, with it being a cognitive load, oftentimes our coaches would put in a blitz pickup or something like that, and they said it was a lot more difficult to show that they had picked up correctly and block effectively when it was just helmets, making it look like they would always lose. I'm not sure about that one, I didn't really watch, but it was just an interesting piece of feedback that I got from some of our O-linemen. This is just a loose practice plan that I put together, not truly knowing much about football practice plans when I wrote it originally, but hopefully this can sort of explain some of the thought processes that went into which drills you ran and where. Day 2 on our yellow day, this was our main contact day, and we continued to sort of pursue tackling drills with our interior defenders on this day, especially stressing single arm tackles when being blocked, as well as increasing the leg drive, especially with our linebackers and D linemen. Being a team that spreads it out a little bit more, that definitely had some impact on completing a day like this. Instead of having sort of an inside run or a half line, we would often have to go to a team run period. They did introduce some of those short throws that are so important in a scheme like ours, and maybe decreases the force a little bit, but fit us a lot better than that. When it came to tempo, this was sort of our normal tempo, so it felt quite simple for our coaches instead of having to make that change with either to slow down or to speed up. Again, just that brief practice plan. Uh, Lots of tackling, lots of block destruction or block creation, as well as this was a time to just introduce some corrections from the day before about things that on film we saw that there were mistakes, as well as introduce anything else that was in the sort of section of install. And then finally, that red day going into a day off, the goal was to really spread the field, as well as lots of repetitions with limited rests. Now, although I didn't sell it to Coach Adam as a testing day, this actually really ended up for them being a testing day of the install on those athletes. Due to the fact there was very little teaching and lots of reps, the goal was, okay, well, we've installed it over the last 2 days now. Can you perform it to the level that we are looking for? And I think this is a really good way to install going forward, as it works as sort of a litmus test for those athletes as they get lots and lots and lots of reps. Obviously, our goal was speed, and we did have some issues reaching both speed distance and speed of reps. One of the original hopes was to go 2 groups at once, sort of to really keep that rest period down nice and low. However, we were not able to film 2 groups, so that slowed us down a little bit. The second one is that when the goal is to spread the field vertically and we have a defense that is as good as ours, they essentially aren't going to give you those deep shots and those sorts of things. So offensively, they played it the right way and took a lot of those underneath concepts. So it was a little bit more difficult to exploit those deep spaces. Thinking in the future, maybe it would have been a good spot to artificially cause the defenders and maybe some of those offensive players to work down the field with a second runner coming in late or something like that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if maybe having these restricted distances and these restrictive tempos due to not going into 2 groups may have ended up being a blessing in disguise, and possibly we weren't ready for it. As mentioned earlier when talking to the O-line, maybe this would have been the day where we would just do helmets due to the less physical nature of passing game and getting the ball out fast. I'm not sure. This would have also added to the stress by making it a little bit faster by taking out those, obviously, the few pounds that the pads are. Not sure how to look at this, but certainly something to think about in the future. And again, just a brief practice plan of how we could have made it look. We did implement the rest on these days, and I do think it was a useful tool to get more effective practice as we got closer to that 2-hour area. So over the practice time, I made sure to document how many plays we had and then the average time between plays to see how we did. Now this includes all team periods and skelly periods, but I don't include team run or smaller group work, as it was a little bit more difficult for me to be able to keep tabs on that. But looking at it, I have to say, give massive credit to our coaches. They really did a great job of sticking to the plan. And as you can see, we are working up from green, yellow, red, and that play clock is staying around where we would like it for the green day, the yellow day. Now the red day, obviously we ran into some of those problems that it was a little bit harder for us to go as fast as we would like to. However, I think as we go through this, that may have not been a bad thing. Now, we finished our spring with a scrimmage against another school, and obviously due to having one side of the field, that really sort of adds a lot of plays into the day. So there's 141 plays run on that day. So if we look at our total team plays, that was a great chunk of them. We were down from the spring before. Now this was something that I caught probably a week in, and asked Coach Adam if he was okay with that. Now we talked about the differences, and he was okay with that. So I think, no such thing as a free lunch and things like that. But if we think about planning for that first game of the season, there's that massive spike in plays. It was the first real hot day here in New Hampshire, and we didn't really have any issues when it came to sort of cramping, and we had no soft tissue injuries in that game period. So it does prove that we could run something like this and be prepared for game number one. Multiple games, however, I'm not sure, thinking about having to recover for the next week. I will say, going back to it, that last 3-day block, practice 10, 11, 12, was 2-minute for us. Now, I thought 2-minute would be perfect for a red day and would also hinder how good our green and yellow days were. However, when we run it and you think about the stops for timeouts, when you're running a 2-minute, the scenario explaining and things like that, it's a very, very slow period with very quick spurts of action. So I actually think it would have been better for a green day outside of anything else. The only other thing that I do want to look at going forward is I think we need to do a little bit better job increasing plays per 3-day rotation. We got a little bit stagnant doing the same number of plays every 3 days, and I would just like to see a little bit of improvement there over those days, so we're just progressing on top of what we've done the week before. So if we look at true injuries from spring ball, we had 0 practices missed due to practice-related soft tissue injuries, and we had 0 non-contact catastrophic injuries as well. We did have a few players end up missing because they were also on the track team, and they had some injuries from running track and being at track practice, and that's something that, as an external coach that oversees both, will have to do a better job of trying to manage that stress. But I think this has to be seen as a success, especially looking at it, and this will be on the next slide, compared to last year. Obviously, we had way too many injuries coming in to the spring, which is something that I have to look at personally myself, but really do think that the training that we did in the dome prior to coming into spring ball and the way that we laid it out and the way that the coaches went about practices really helped us reach these successful margins, as well as a good little bit of luck. So again, I just wanted to compare this year to last year. Now, the first thing looking at this is obviously I was looking back through an old software when it came to the spring 23 injuries. I wasn't there. I didn't see them happen, so it's hard to decide what's avoidable and things like that. Obviously, I've called a avoidable injury something that is soft tissue and is in non-contact. So looking at us and all the injuries that we had that lagged over from our 9 weeks, we had 38 practices missed, and then looking at what was available to me and going back to look at the schedule from last year, we looked at about 60 practices missed. Now, again, I don't know how true that is because I simply wasn't there, and I don't know. These people could have done stuff in practice that I'm just not aware of, not being there. But trying to make a comparison, trying to be as quantitative as I can, I'm hoping that this does show that we maybe have done some good with our spring. Same number of hamstring injuries is obviously something that needs some reviewing from my end and making sure that we deal with those. But got to be happy that looking at it, they had 6 during the practices and we had none. So got to be pleased there. And then to conclude, got to be pleased but somewhat frustrated with how we did. For our first real spring and the first time that I could really impact the team, I think it went quite well. We had obviously some improvements, and subjectively the coaches and the players, they were really happy with the improvements and what we went about doing. I also got to really be pleased with no injuries during spring ball, how well the ideas worked, and that these can be changeable but very applicable to full camp. And with that being the goal of the entire process, I think we've got to be happy there. Obviously, luck has something to do with it, but we got to take that as a win. Most of the frustrations come from the number of injuries that we had during the spring, especially my first real weight room injury, and now got to look at the volumes and the intensities that we went through and make those changes there. As I said in the beginning, no one was actually asking for this. And if you have listened to this point, I just want to say thank you for listening and really appreciate you taking the time to listen to some nobody talk about what they did. If you have any comments, thoughts, or ways that I could make this better or things that you've done, my email is there on the slide. And once again, thank you very much.